Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. But I'm Christina Höppner, a member of the Executive Committee of Flexible Learning Association New Zealand. Sorry, I always want to say Aotearoa New Zealand. Flexible Learning Association of New Zealand. And would like to welcome you to our latest webinar, this time with Derek Renmarth and Dr. Michael Barber. To get us started and also situated in today's session, let us start with a karakia. Whaia te maturanga kia marama, kia whai take na mahi katoa. Tō maia, tō kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. So it was my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's session that has been scheduled really, really briefly. So thank you so much for having seen all the announcements, because Derek and Michael just very recently published their report Tua Te Hononga Tangata, Tua Te Hononga Ao, Taking the Pulse of Distance Learning in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so it is fantastic to have them both here today. Michael joins us from California, where he's the Director of Faculty Development and Professor of Instruction for the College of Education and Health Sciences at Touro University, California. And Derek Renmarth is not too far away from most of you, living in the Wellington region, and he's the founder of Future Makers, which he established after stepping back from his position as Director of E-Learning at Core Education. And both of them, for those of you who have been involved in distance learning, distance education here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, are no new names. So let's welcome our friends, and I'll hand it over to the two of them so that they can tell us a bit more about the report and whatever they'd like to share that might not even be in the report. Over to you two.
Thank you much, and thanks for that introduction. I'll just start sharing my screen here. As Christina mentioned, I'm Michael Barber. My colleague Derek Renmarth is there at the top of the screen as well, or I guess depending on where you're situated, the side of the screen in my case. And this is a report that we've been actually talking about and hoping to do for quite some time now. This, over the past, I guess, about 6 months or so, we finally got the opportunity to actively engage in it. And so we're here just to tell you a little bit about it today. So to get started, the first thing I want to say is that we had a number of organizations that provided either financial sponsorship or financial backing to this particular project, or in-kind sponsorship for it. My own university put up a nice grant that allowed me to come over and do a lot of this work. The Educational Partnership and Innovation Trust put forward some funding, which is allowing us to extend some of the report, which we'll talk a little bit about at the end. Derek and his organization Future Makers were able to contribute in an in-kind fashion, as well as FLANS themselves are the website hosts for the project going forward, and we intend to make this an annual project, so that'll be an annual in-kind contribution that FLANS is making for us. And as someone who's done other reports similar to this, I'll be honest and say that without the contributions of these folks, this type of report just doesn't happen. So as Christina just dropped in the chat there, the website for this is flans.org.nz/DL-pulse/, or you can just do the easy thing and click on the link in the chat, and that'll get you there, although don't go there until another 53 minutes from now, because you'll lose us. So the idea for this report, or the first, I guess, backing for this report, came about with some other work that Derek and I were doing well over a decade ago. Basically, the precursor to FLANS was Deans, and 12 years ago, I guess 13 years ago now, I had a sabbatical at the time and was over there and did one of the first national studies into the virtual learning network in New Zealand. And then a couple of years later, Derek and I, because in between those two reports, Derek actually did one for what was the virtual learning network community at the time, offering three sort of ways in which they could become sustainable. So 2 years later, we did together a second report that sort of looked at all the different recommendations that had been made in those two reports and other things that were being published at the time to try to come up with what should unfold in at least the virtual learning sector at the time. In both of those reports, one of the key recommendations was we actually needed to do a national study, because while there were pieces that were getting known as terms of how much activity was happening in different sectors, there was no sort of global perspective in terms of what was happening within the school sector, broadly speaking. We had some good data from some of the virtual learning network clusters at the time, others not so much. The Takura, or at the time it was still the correspondence school, had a lot of information that was available. There wasn't much coming out of the health schools at that point in time. I have no idea how many, if any, of the privates that we looked at were operating at the time. My guess is at least one or two of them, I believe, were operating back then, but I don't think it was more than that. So we wanted to create this national study, and the idea behind the national study was to mimic the type of thing that we had seen going on in Canada. And this is the one that I've been responsible for in Canada for the last 16, we're in the 17th year now, and in the US. And as you can see in the US, they actually beat me to it by a couple of years. But we had these other examples in North America that really took a good look at what was happening in terms of governance and activity all across the country. And that's really what we were looking for in the New Zealand context. One of the obviously differences between Canada and US and New Zealand was over in North America, it was obviously done by jurisdiction, by province or state, whereas there wasn't a need to do that in New Zealand because it was just one single jurisdiction, which presented some of its own challenges. Now, knowing that, and I don't recognize all of the names in the audience, but I only recognize, I think, two or three as being in the school sector. So for those of you that distance learning in the school sector might be a little bit new or a little bit unfamiliar, one of the things that we do in the report, and I'm just noticing that I made a typo here. It's the nice thing about not doing it in presentation mode. I can fix things up as I'm going along. One of the things that we do have in the report that takes up the first probably 10 or 12 pages is a little look at the history of how distance learning has evolved over time in the school sector. And I won't spend a lot of time at this, but it's interesting to note that for those of you who are in the tertiary sector, the stages aren't all that different, but I think there's some interesting nuances along the way. So this idea of shift going from, an initial start with more correspondence-based education to playing around with educational radio and instructional television, and then initially with computer-assisted instruction, and then really moving into the virtual learning environment with video conferencing, and which ends up turning into environments like this as the technology and the bandwidth gets better. That, I think, is a common journey that those of you in the tertiary environment are probably familiar with, because many of your own institutions that have any experience with distance learning probably had a similar type context, similar type of trajectory. One of the things that happened in the school sector that I think is a little bit different is what starts to happen after we get the development of virtual learning. Because what ends up starting is you get some support from the Ministry of Education for these individual clusters, as they were called at the time. And there is a great deal of growth that starts to happen. And while that's happening, independent of that, we start to see this kind of growth that's happening in the urban environment, although that tends to be focused more on blended and hybrid learning, although they didn't call it hybrid learning at the time. than it does the more distance virtual learning that you see in the rural and remote environments. While all this is happening, you have the correspondence school that is going through its own evolution to a more virtual environment, although because of the nature of the organization, they're moving more into an asynchronous online environment and moving into, creating a lot of instructional materials and developing an asynchronous instructional model that can be delivered through a learning management system. So there are all these sort of things happening in that 2000s and early 2010s teens type time frame. Something else that, well, I know my tertiary colleagues are familiar with, but it was a little bit different for them, were the cycles. We call it cycles of consultation. I would have called it a death spiral of consultation, to be honest with you, because you end up, there's a parliamentary inquiry on 21st century learning. There is a consulting company that really has little history in this space at all, that's contracted to, come up with a plan for going forward. If you want to go back, that first report that I mentioned that we did back in 2011 was also funded by the Ministry of Education. So there's a number of these cycles that are happening again and again. And really, it's just going and covering the same ground. The one that was done by that consulting company I mentioned, even before they finished their process, the government was already announcing that it was going to be folded into the larger review of tomorrow's schools, which it was, but it got like 2 paragraphs in a 200-page report. So I'm not sure how much really it was folded in, as opposed to just being an afterthought that was dropped in somewhere along the line because they said, oh, we forgot we were supposed to mention something about distance and virtual learning in here. Let me write up a couple of paragraphs and figure out where I could put it. And then many of you are likely familiar with the Education Amendment update that we went through, which introduced and approved COOLs. And then before the first one could even be approved, they were repealed when the new government came into play. And then, much like happened in the tertiary environment, when COVID came around, we had that great pivot to remote learning, not distance or online learning, but remote learning. And, we're now just starting to get back into a new normal as we come out of that. And so while there are some parallels, I think, with the tertiary sector, I think there are some unique aspects that were happening in the school sector that I think were important along this. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to look at the report, if you are in the tertiary sector and this is an area you're interested in, I think those ones, particularly as we get into this, starting with that section there. So that middle part, I think, is probably the part that would be a little bit different than what you guys would have experienced in the tertiary environment. So to the actual study. So what we were looking to do was, for the 2023 school year, so the most recent school year that had been completed, we were looking to essentially identify all of the providers of distance learning throughout the country, providers of distance learning at the school sector level throughout the country, and then find out essentially how they were governed or regulated or operated in terms of the structure that they worked under, how they were resourced, because depending on the type of school that they are and what they did, they were resourced in many cases very differently. And then exactly what level of activity, what was the extent of the activity that was happening? How many students were we talking about? And beyond just how many, individual students, what does that look like in terms of a larger number, proportionally speaking? So in order to undertake this, we created a survey that we sent out to all of the providers of distance learning that we could find. And oftentimes we were finding new ones as we were actually in the midst of the research itself. In many cases, we had to do follow-up interviews. Now, in some cases, those interviews were in person. In most cases, it was emails back and forth as we were trying to figure out exactly what things meant, because one of the main challenges we did come up with is that there wasn't a common language that people had as we were going through, and even ourselves, If you looked at our original survey that we sent out, I think we used 3 different terms in the same survey for the notion of a distance learning provider, because there wasn't that sort of common language. And then we did a great deal of document analysis, particularly around certain types of schools. There was a lot of regulatory text that we could actually go through and use to help us figure that out. As we developed profiles for each of the individual providers, we sent them back to the folks in charge of the programs, of the schools or programs, to ensure that we got things accurate. And there was a bit of back and forth with those, where our main concern was around accuracy as opposed to whether or not, and there were some disagreements about how folks felt they were portrayed. But Derek and I, as we went through it, focused upon, were we misinterpreting things? Were we getting things wrong, as opposed to were we presenting them in necessarily a positive or negative or neutral light? So that's sort of how we put that together. Derek, I don't know if you want to add anything in terms of process that I might have missed.
No, I think you've captured what was going through my mind. I'll carry on.
All right. So getting into the meat of this, the first thing we had to do, and this pulls into actually really it really helps us with the crux of the first 2 research questions that we were looking at. As I mentioned, we didn't have a common language in terms of how to talk about these different providers. I used the term, even in the table, we were still struggling with this when we started the report, and we used the term entities in the report. I think as we've started to flesh this out a little bit more, and as we're moving forward now, I think providers is the term we're going to come into, because entity seems like it's something that should be out of a Marvel movie or something like that, but providers, I think, is a much better way of looking at it. So we came up with 2 broad types. There were some that were defined from a legislative standpoint as schools, and then there were others that simply just weren't defined by legislation. And we chose the term program for those particular ones. Now, we chose program for a couple of reasons. One is because most of the other terms we were thinking of were used either by the Ministry of Education or had specific legislative meaning that didn't include these types of distance learning providers. We thought about, we did think about things like entity. We thought about organizations. Trying to think of some of the other terms we were banting about, Derek, off the top of our head.
Yeah, no, they're the main ones we talked about, but yes, there were several.
So, and the first ones were kind of easy. The schools, because it's written right into the Education Act. It defines what they are and the different types of them. So that was the easy one. The program was a little bit more difficult. And then we subdivided things between, we were initially talking about public and private for both of them. But because programs weren't necessarily schools, and in theory, even the nonprofit ones were still private entities, even if they weren't working for the most part. And in many cases, they worked with both public and private schools, although the vast majority of the people they worked with were public schools or state schools, but they did work with both. So trying to come up with a little bit of a nomenclature around that. So at least within the legislation, the public schools that we identified as either currently having or having historically had being providers of distance learning. Obviously, distance school, which is one of the legislative items, which right now TACURA is the only entity, the only provider that is indicated as a distance school in the legislation. There were also special institutions, and there were 4 of these, the 3 health schools and the deaf school. There are state schools that do provide distance education. So not that participate in one of the programs below, but ones that actually provide. And we did identify and highlight one of those. We're quite confident that there's a lot more of them going forward, but it's up to us, and for that matter them, to help us self-identify who they are. Historically, there have been some tertiary institutions that have provided school level learning. We weren't able to identify any that were doing it during the 2023 school year. But if you go back, especially in that history section, we even mentioned specifically some that had done that in the past. And then there were private schools that were there as well. If you've been following the news over the last couple of weeks, I'm guessing that when we do next year's annual report, there will be another category in the public one, because we've already had media reports where 2 of those private schools have mused about about applying to become charter schools. I don't think either of them have actually put in applications for it yet. I'm not sure if the applications are actually available to do that yet, to be honest with you. But there have been media reports that at least 2 of them have been thinking about doing that. So next year there will likely be 5 up there in that public school category. And then moving down to the programs, we divided them up. There were 2 main programs right now that operate in a nonprofit way, with the vast majority of their the schools that they work with being a state school. Both of them, I think, have some private school involvement with them, but those private schools that are working with them work the same way that any public school would. And then there was one program that operated entirely as a for-profit entity. So depending upon where you fell on this particular matrix, if you were, or on this particular table, largely depended upon both how you were regulated and how you were resourced, or how you were governed and how you were resourced. So moving to the providers that we actually found, I should have put this slide a little bit later now that I'm thinking about it, but it's here now. So this is it. So the public distance learning schools that we had, so those that fell either under the distance school, or in all honesty, the special educator, the special institution category, those were Takura, the 3 health schools, and the Deaf Education New Zealand program. The 2 nonprofit programs, Kotuiaku and Net NZ. The 1 state school or public school that we knew of that were providing distance learning were Rosemary, which basically they had 3 particular programs that they were providing. And that lead was actually provided to us by one of the leaders of one of the nonprofit programs that were out there. For those of you who are in the room, if you are aware of other brick and mortar schools that are actually providing distance learning opportunities for students at their and other schools, we would love to know who they are, because we'd love to start to include those in there. As you can see on the right side of the screen, we had 9 private school programs that we were able to identify. I should note that 2 of them didn't actually enroll any students during the 2023 school year. So basically the first one up there, 3H School International, and then the last one, Pinnacle Global, didn't enroll any students during the most recent school year that's finished. And but because this was our first report, we wanted to include them. As best we could tell, 3H may have enrolled students during the 2022 school year and then have ceased to exist. As best we can tell, Pinnacle only got started in 2021, and they are still trying to enroll their initial students, because they still seem to have a presence online. I don't know if they have students in this school year or not. I guess we'll find that out in about 10 months or so, when we start to do the next one. And as I mentioned, 2 of them, the ones that have been mentioned in the media, are AGE School. I assume they do the initials because they capitalize the AGE, so I assume it's not Age School. I think it's AGE School. And Crimson were the 2 that have been mentioned in media reports as potentially moving to that charter school classification. And then, as I mentioned, there was 1 for-profit program in Spectrum. So if you're looking at how these programs are governed, and again, it goes back to the chart that we were looking at here. So anything that's up in this school category has there's language about it in the Education Act. So as you're looking at the distance, special, and private schools, all of them specifically have language around them about how they operate. And in the case of the distance school, which would be Takura, it's extensive. When you go to the actual report, our profile around Takura is by far the longest. It's about 3 to 4 times longer than any of the others. And the main reason for that is simply because there is so much regulation that they have to follow between what's in the Education Act, what's published in the New Zealand Gazette, plus they have while all schools have to follow a collective agreement either with the primary or the secondary unions, Takura actually has a separate collective agreement with the PPTA around how they operate. So there's additional provisions that go above and beyond what would be the normal expectation for a regular teacher for Takura. So because of that, that's, if what we say about their programming and about their resourcing and about their numbers are about the same length as what we have for most of the others, but what we've got to say about their governance is just there's just so much there. And the more we dug into it, particularly as we started to get into the actual, wording of how the legislation was put together, how different regulations were put together in the New Zealand Gazette, even just various provisions in the collective agreement that they've got with the teachers unions, it was quite extensive. As you can see here, basically the Education Act is all that governs privates. Special schools have both stuff in the legislation as well as in the Gazette that they have to follow. And the two public or the two nonprofit, actually, I should fix that. This is why I don't post my slides till afterwards. Because I keep thinking of the nonprofit programs as being public programs, but to keep with what we've got in the report, I'll call them nonprofit here. Both of those are set up as charitable trusts. So they're governed by a trust document that they have to follow. And then each of the trusts have boards that oversee the folks who are actually running the program. And in full disclosure, I'm on the board of one of those two particular programs and have been for programs there for quite some time. I don't know if you want to add anything at this stage, Derek. And we're getting
You're pretty comprehensive, Michael. Carry on.
All right. And so when it comes to resourcing as well, what you're finding is the resourcing for the most part for the schools are all largely dictated by either the Act or the Gazette, to be perfectly honest with you. So in the case of the private schools, they have the ability to apply for some public funding, but for the most part, their provisioning and resourcing is done almost, I won't say almost exclusively, but the vast majority of it is through tuition dollars. The special schools have very specific guidelines around how they are funded. And for the most part, they get funded at roughly the same level or higher than what a regular state school would be. And then Takura has, again, this really convoluted process depending upon if you are a full-time student or dual enrolled student, or if you are an adult student, or if you are they've got 3 or 4 special categories in there, and each of them have different funding formulas that apply to them. Generally speaking, you can look at them and say that they get about 50% of the FTE that a regular state school would get for most of their students, but that doesn't apply to all of their students because of the really detailed nature of the funding formula that they have. In the case of the nonprofits, they historically have gotten some services that were provided by the Ministry of Education. In many cases throughout the years, they've had contracts that provide some of the provisioning, but most of their resourcing comes from their member schools. So their member schools basically have, depending on the program, in some cases it's an initial fee. and then the provision of a teacher that gets you X number of enrollments, or if you aren't able to provide a teacher, you would provide the monetary equivalent for doing so. And then while not on this page, the for-profit programs, those are really the X factor in here because they are essentially a private business. So there is nothing that regulates them beyond the fact that their students, for the most part, have to be enrolled as homeschool students under the Education and Training Act. Beyond that, they get no, all of their resourcing comes from, private tuition dollars, and they have no regulatory environment. They have no larger governance structure in terms of a board or anything like that. It is basically the owner of the for-profit program is the law, if you will. And there's not really another way to sort of describe that aspect of it. In terms of the activity, this is the stuff that really got us, because the governance stuff, even without knowing what the common language was, if you wanted to go to an individual program and look up how they were governed, you could kind of figure that out because you knew where to look. This is the type of information that really was largely new to us. And as you see, it's still not as refined as what we would like it. So you can see here, supplemental would be those that are taking one or more courses online. So these are brick and mortar students that are enrolled in a course or two or more from the distance learning provider. If you're looking at the legislation, it would be the dual enrollment students that are part of the Takura environment. Full-time are those folks that aren't part of a brick and mortar environment at all, although that is a little bit misleading in the case of the health schools. So you can see how they're sort of broken down there. The numbers for the health schools are, like I say, it's a little bit misleading. That's why there's one asterisk there, because we pulled out the numbers of students that we knew were also being served by Takura, because we actually knew what those numbers are. But some of these students, so if I were to use, say, the Northern Health School as an example, of those 1,900 students that are there, some of them are actually back in their brick and mortar classrooms for maybe a day or two a week, and then still being served by the Northern Health School. Some of them are at home all of the time, and a teacher from the Northern Health School actually physically comes to them and teaches them at a distance the rest of the time. In some cases, they will come to a center, one of the, I think it's 16 or 17 that the Northern Health School has throughout the northern region. So the exact number of that 1,905 that are actually truly at a distance is something that not even the health school themselves would be able to give us an accounting of, unless they sort of went through the enrollment one by one and figured out, okay, what is this student doing now? And because the goal for the health schools are to get those students to reintegrate back into their traditional brick and mortar face-to-face environments, that number would change literally on a daily basis. Even the number itself, that includes the number of unique students that they had. So at no point during the last school year did the Northern Health School actually have 1,905 students at any given time. They might have had 800 in the first week and then 900 in the second week, but only 700 of them were in the first week. So they had 200 new students. So really now there's 1,000 different students that they've worked with, because 100 of them have gone back to their, so that kind of changing environment really makes that difficult for them to come up with. When we look at the numbers that we're getting from Deaf Education, Kotoyako, and to a lesser extent NetNZ, there are some of those students that are also enrolled in courses in Takura. So if I'm taking a course from Takura and I'm also taking, say, a course from NetNZ, I'm showing up twice on that list, but I'm only one unique student. So when I look at that total of 13,691 at the bottom, I could be counted in there twice. In fact, if I was taking a course from one of the privates, for example, and Net NZ and Takura, I could show up in there 3 times. If I happen to have gone to a health school for a month during the school year, I could be in this chart 4 times. So the number of unique students that we have, and that's one of the reasons why we have the tilde there at the bottom, because we aren't really sure exactly what the exact number is. And that's also one of the reasons why we provide that range for the full time, because there's a lot of leeway that you see in there. The other problem that we had is with the private programs, because so many of them did not participate in our data collection that we had. While we were able to get the number of students that were enrolled in those particular schools, most of those schools, at least all the ones with the 3 asterisks by them, they had a in-person option and a distance option. So of, say, for example, the 92 students at AGE school, 91 of them might have been in the in-person school, and only 1 of them might have been taken at a distance. For that matter, 91 of them could have been taken at a distance, and they might have had a physical school of only 1, although that's kind of unlikely, because why would you have a full school for 1 student? But you get what I mean. So those numbers could be the bottom end of that number that's there, or it could be the top end. And until we can get their participation in this study, it'll be difficult for us to really get a sense as to the exact number that we have here. Now, if you break it down sort of, by some of the categories that we have here, you start to get some interesting figures. So here on this table, you can see we've got the total number of students that are in each of those particular environments. So the total number of primary students across the country, the total number of secondary students, the total number that are in composite schools, special schools, home-based education, and so on. And then you can see, at least based upon our figures from the previous table, what we think are the number of distance learning students in each of those different environments. And you can get a sense as what proportion that is across the country. So as an example, and obviously the special institution or special school category is skewed because it's all the health school students, but about 2/3 of the health school, about 2/3 of special students take some form of education at a distance. Less than 1% of primary school students across the country are enrolled in 1 or more distance learning opportunities. Approaching 10% of secondary students. Again, with all the caveats that we were talking about earlier in terms of the inability to count some of these numbers. But when you look at it this way, it really gives you a sense as to how some of this is a little bit different. And even when you look at the home-based education one, we've got 0.1 in there as our number, but we really aren't sure about that. The New Zealand Homeschool Association, I can't remember the exact name of it now off the top of my head. But when I reached out to them and asked them about the different, services they don't provide, they broker. And when you read through on their website the different services that they broker, many of them do seem like the self-paced distance learning type things that a lot of the private schools are providing. So my guess is that a lot more of those 10,777 home-based education students are probably engaged in some form of distance learning through one of these brokers that are provided by 1 or more of the homeschool associations that are throughout the country. So when we're looking at the activity, there's a couple of, I guess, broad takeaways that you want to make. When you calculate it all up, it works out to about 4% of all students in the school sector had enrolled in, and I call it courses, really it's distance learning opportunities, because depending upon the level that they're doing, and when you look at the things being offered at by the special institutions like the health school and deaf education, in many cases they're not courses that they're offering, it's programming that they're providing. But about 4%, so roughly almost 1 out of every 20 students in the country last year took at least some kind of distance learning opportunity. that varies significantly depending on the type of school and the level of the student. And, you know, when you look at sort of the range, I think we can safely or comfortably estimate that about 1% of the primary population is engaged in this. We're getting close to 10% of the secondary population that's engaged in this type of learning. My guess is, while we don't have the data, if we were looking at historic data or as we continue to collect this over time, we'll have seen that if we look back in time, that both of those numbers have grown significantly. And I think that as we move forward, we'll see them continue to grow. As an aside, I can tell you that in Canada, it's about 6% of all K-12 students, or all students in the school sector, that are engaged in some form of distance learning. And in the US, it's estimated between 5 and 8%. So New Zealand as a country is basically roughly in the same ballpark as those two other jurisdictions that we actually have national data for. But that's sort of kind of where we're sitting right now in terms of the activity. The other thing that I should have mentioned back in the methodology slide that I'll mention now, obviously this is traditional distance learning opportunities. So these are planned distance learning opportunities. It's not the remote learning type environments, the hybrid learning type environments that we've seen put in as temporary measures due to, you know, COVID or other natural disasters that it seems to always inflict you guys just about every school year lately. You know, these are ones where I like to call them traditional distance learning ones that were planned and thought out and intended for this delivery, regardless of circumstance, as opposed to those that were just put in place because of circumstance. I don't know if you want to add anything about the activity, Derek.
No, I'm just pleased you raised the bit about hybrid, because that was a big part of our discussion, and to deliberately exclude them was an important part of making sure our focus was just on, you know, the traditional conventional distance ed providers. And like Michael's saying, we would expect, or we'd anticipate, a rise in these numbers given the current level of kind of interest in the way things are working. So this is providing an excellent benchmark, I think.
The only other thing that we really hadn't intended to collect much data on this, but as we started looking at the nature of programming, because you notice we didn't have a research question around instructional models. But really, there were three dominant models that emerged as we started looking at how folks provided programming. There was the asynchronous model, and this is the model that Takura uses, where they have a teacher that's responsible for creating online course content, and that's housed in a learning management system. And then they use all of the tools of the learning management system to actually deliver that course. So it's not a correspondence model just gone online, which in all honesty, when you look at the history of Takura, as they started to move to online initially, that is really what it was. In the past, I'm going to peg it at about 8 years or so. Derek, you might be able to give me a firmer number on that. But in the past 8 years, I think they've really done a good job of moving beyond an online version of correspondence education to truly providing asynchronous online learning. And, you know, it wasn't like a switch that just 8 years ago got turned on. This has been something that they've been developing over time. Most of the other programs, so when we look at the special institutions, when we look at the nonprofit programs that are out there, even the state schools or the public schools that are providing distance learning, the majority of instruction that they provide is a synchronous model of instruction. And then when it comes to the privates, most of them tend to be using a self-paced independent learning model. That's sort of a nice way of saying that it looks a lot like a correspondence model, except for instead of focusing around courses, it focuses around the individual student. So in most of these environments, the first thing that happens is the teacher that is assigned to the student would meet with them and come up with an individualized or personalized learning plan. And then from that point on, it looks very much like what our traditional correspondence education would have looked like. And that's how, I won't say all, because Crimson and One School Global in particular, as well as Mount Hobson, really are different than that. But the other 6 that are there, they really utilize this independent learning model. And in many cases, not even with instruction or with the printed packets or the asynchronous content that they create themselves. In many cases, it's stuff that's leased. Actually, several of them use a Christian-based program out of the US that has a lot of controversy associated with it, to be perfectly honest with you. So that's not something we necessarily intended to look at. Something as we move forward, we will probably spend more time diving into, and hopefully trying to be able to provide some good examples of this kind of environment, because as an example, those that are using primarily the synchronous model, some of the lessons that were being learned from how to create effective ways in the asynchronous one could come in handy. Ways in which the programs that are primarily using the asynchronous model could be incorporating more synchronous into their environment, and finding good examples that we can leverage to show that, I think, would just improve the delivery of distance learning for all of these schools and programs, to be honest with you. So as we're getting with about 10 minutes left or so, I just wanted, because I anticipated I would do most of the talking as I've been going through here. And so I wanted to give, well, Derek, and then I can play off him if something comes to mind. We've done this study now, and we've got a couple of others that are either close to being finished or that we're just starting. So we've had a chance to do a real sort of systematic dive into this in a very relatively short period of time. So I want to give Derek a chance to sort of, as we've looked at this over the past couple of months, if there are things that I haven't had a chance to touch on that you really wanted to underscore before we sort of open this up to questions.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think in the interest of time, particularly, there's not a lot to add to what you said, because I think you've given a very good overview. The only thing I did want to just draw attention was on that previous slide. I think there's a lot there that will resonate for the people on this particular webinar, because the interests that we've long held in the tertiary sector around the choice or the structure of the module, the link between asynchronous, synchronous, the things that Michael has outlined, is where there's a real curiosity as more and more online or distance education occurs. And it's a personal perspective, but it came out through some of our interviews and studies to find out the extent to which the choice of model is often predicated simply on a personal hunch or a particular disposition of the group, organization, or even individual, rather than necessarily being linked strongly to anything that we would say is grounded in research. And as Michael was starting to talk about, we're getting a lot of nuanced decision making now also between a one-size-fits-all model that may be characteristic of a particular organization, without drilling down and saying, well, actually, sometimes the modality will vary depending on the particular subject or focus for instruction, for example, or the nature of the group or individuals taking place. So I think this is an exciting area for future research, not just within the project we've done, but within distance ed more broadly.
So before we open it up to questions, just want to let you know that we had a secondary study that we were doing in this, where we were interviewing stakeholders from across the country involved in the school sector, some directly involved, some indirectly involved, many government agency and other support organizations, asking them about sort of what their vision of a future ecosystem for schools in New Zealand was. So Derek will be presenting that at the FLANS conference next month. And we hope to have a paper that we can submit to the Journal of Open, Flexible, and Distance Learning shortly thereafter, probably in the conference edition, fingers crossed. And right now we actually, I made the mistake of sending it out during school holiday, so I'm going to have to start sending reminders now next week that people are actually back from school holiday. But we did send out and this is largely we were able to do because of the funding we got from the Educational Partnership and Innovation Trust. We were able to ask the providers that we've identified for data that they had from 2019 through 22, so that we would have, including the one study we've just done, we'd have 5 full years of data, a pre-pandemic year, 3 sort of pandemic influenced years, and then ideally I would like to think that 23 was sort of our first post-pandemic year, and that'll really give us a good sense as to be able to figure out some of that. So again, the website is there, and we've got about 7 minutes for questions.
But also Derek for presenting your report and some of the findings. Michael, do you maybe want to jump out of the screen share so that it's easier to see everybody? So yes, do we have any questions?
Yeah, I do. I was giving everybody else a chance to ask first. It's just occurred to me as you're presenting, and I spent some time going through the report yesterday, as you're probably aware, Michael, because I was firing you some questions. But I've just thought too that in the model for the VLN, that schools actually provide programs, and I wondered, did you discuss whether schools should also be appearing there as being contributors and participators in their own right?
Yes, we did have that conversation. Actually, I think we even have some language about that in the nomenclature section of the report, because in programs in general, and this is not just a New Zealand situation, this is what happens in North America, it's what happens in Australia as well, and at least in 2 programs I'm aware of in England. They have that co-op model that you guys are familiar with, where you either through membership or through contribution become a member of the cooperative, and you basically contribute to the cooperative in the form of providing a teacher who is actually the one who's providing the distance learning, and you then receive an equal amount, and if you want more, you contribute more. But the reality is that wouldn't happen without some kind of broker, right? So if the VLN clusters didn't exist, it might happen in 1 or 2 schools might partner with each other to do that kind of thing, and we saw that actually as a good example, the Illinois Virtual High School. That's one of the ways in which it was formed. I was in Canada working at a school that was providing distance learning to 5 or 6 schools in my district. But even within those 5 or 6 schools, none of my classes had more than single-digit enrollments. I had a colleague that I had met at an AP reading a couple of years earlier, and reached out to him because I knew he taught at least 3 of the courses we were offering, and asked him if he would take his in-person class and partner with my distance students so that I'd have enough people to have discussions and stuff like that in the learning management system. Essentially, I was providing distance learning to him, and he was providing distance learning to me. But it wouldn't have gone beyond our 2 schools had there not been some sort of broker that was there. So it was that brokerage aspect that made it become a program. So that's why we decided to do that, because the other thing that you run into with that is if you have, I'm just going to make up some numbers here now, but if you have a VLN cluster that has 6 schools that can't provide a teacher, so they provide the money, so that cluster then provides the teacher, they're a provider. But then if they also have 20 other schools that are able to provide a teacher, now you've got 20 providers, well 21 if you count the program there. None of them would exist without the cluster in the first place in terms of the distance learning provider. So that's why we chose not to do that. And if you look at the way in which we presented Rosemi in the report, we focused upon the programs that were outside of the scope of their involvement with any of the VLN clusters. But no, we debated that a fair amount because we were trying to figure out, because we figured there's going to be a lot more like the Rosemis, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong because I don't know where the dash should be in terms of the
Rosemary. Yeah,
okay.
I just sort of think
we figure there's a lot more like that out there, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
Many of which are likely participating in one of the clusters.
Yeah, from the health of things that taking the pulse, I guess, from their perspective is around who's engaged. It's just a different level from looking at students, from looking at schools, because schools sort of go through the system, if that makes sense. The participation of schools is something that we've always reported on, and I've just noticed, well, it's an element that's missing out of this report.
Yeah, I think at some point we say the total number of schools that were in there, and if we didn't, it's only because we weren't able to get that data from everybody, because we wanted to be consistent in what we were providing. And the other thing it brings up, if you look at like the health schools as an example, or the deaf education, any of the 3 special institutions or 4 special institutions, in many cases, they are working in partnership with those special institutions. Do we count all of those folks as being providers? Because they are providing some distance learning aspects when you look at it. So it was a decision as to where you draw the line, and we looked at the line in terms of those that were brokering services, which is also why we used the broad term of provider.
Michael, for answering Rachel's question. And looking at the time, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for the questions. However, Michael, you had already alluded to the fact that people can catch up with Derek at the FLANCE conference that we're having in just a few weeks. I did also put the link into the chat, so please do come along to not just listen to Derek, but many others who are presenting their research and their ideas and projects at next month's conference in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. If you are not yet a member of Flexible Learning Association New Zealand, we'd definitely also like to invite you to join us so that we can provide more of these webinars. And I'm sure that Derek and Micah will have a few more webinars lined up in the coming weeks to talk about the report. And if you catch any of them, you do have more opportunities to ask them any questions. So thank you, everybody.
Actually, we have one with NEX coming up next month, NEX, and that is going to be more focused on because it's more of a K-12 audience. We'll probably spend a lot more time talking about and trying to dissect what we learned about those 3 instructional models, because I think that'll be something that would be of greater interest to that audience, probably less on the policy and the resourcing aspect, because other than the individual leaders, the teachers probably aren't interested as much in that. And then in early September, we have one with the Educational Partnership and Innovation Trust, which will probably focus a little bit on both this study as well as that future-looking study that we were talking about. So if you go to all 3, you'll get a slightly different perspective on the research, depending upon the audience.
Perfect. And Michael and Derek, if you can send me all the links to those events that you've just mentioned for the registration pages, I'm happy to include them into the follow-up for this webinar when I'm going to send out the link to this recording, and that'll happen once I've corrected the transcript. And then you have easy access to all those links. So thanks, everybody. And now just our karakia before we are all heading off to do some other things. Kia whakaere te tapo, kia watea ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, homye uye ai kia. Kia ora. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.